Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Today, the state of the Canada-US relationship. As one Canadian political wit once said, the Americans are our best friends, whether we like it or not, and we are their best friends, whether they know it or not. I guess the question is, but are we really each other's best friends? To discuss that today, Brian Lee Crowley. He is head of the MacDonald-Laurier Institute, a public policy think tank, and he's just set up an American equivalent so that we can really have this discussion cross-border, because he had a message for both sides, really. The Americans need to take us more seriously, and we need to take our role in the world more seriously. So, Brian, welcome. It's great to see you.
Pamela, it's great to be here, and particularly to have a conversation with you because you're so knowledgeable about the Canada-US relationship, having spent, several years in New York City, our consul general. So you've wrestled personally with many of the issues that you and I want to talk about.
It really is a conundrum, and there's no other way to put it, because we sort of think that this relationship is one of equals, but it's not. There's a reason. They are 10 times larger. Yes, we supply a lot of valuable things, but in terms of the world balance. So let's just take a look at that we continue, and I think that these are your words, we need a new era in relations, because we can no longer have one that's based on the comfortable myths that we tell each other endlessly about being each other's best friends. What triggered this?
Well, I've been quite concerned about the direction of Canada-US relationship, the relationship for several years. Yeah. But, in just the last little while, I've noticed a number of American initiatives that normally would have had Canada as an early adopter, an early partner. I'm thinking about the so-called AUKUS, which brings together Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States in a defense pact in the Indo-Pacific. We are a Pacific power. Canada would have automatically been at the table for that discussion. We weren't even invited to the table this time as they were discussing, defense cooperation, purchase of submarines, technological cooperation. The Quad is another good example. As the world tries to evolve an architecture that can deal with the rise of China, for example, which is probably the biggest challenge the world faces right now. The Quad brought together, again, Australia and India and Japan and the United States to talk about how could these friends and allies, like-minded countries with liberal democracies, how could they organize themselves to deal with China rise? Again, Canada is not at the table. It's not a quint, it's a quad. Canada is not at the table. And I could bring out a number of other examples where Canada would normally have just expected in the ordinary course of things to be invited to the conversation. And quite frankly, the other people at the table didn't even think about Canada because they think Canada brings anything to the table.
I remember back right at the time after 9/11, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Paul Salucci, said, and this was a particular time, but he said, understand one thing about America: security trumps trade. It will always trump trade. And people thought, oh, okay, maybe that was in the context of 9/11, but it's not. It's the truth. 365. And we have a hard time understanding that if we're not making our contributions to NATO, if we're not providing energy sources to friends and allies abroad who need it, then we're not in the game.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If you want to be taken seriously internationally, you can't be the one who's always there with your hand out asking for something. You have to have something to contribute. It's a two-way street. And I think, a Canada that doesn't bother to meet its own NATO commitment. I mean, nobody imposed our commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense. This was something that we collectively in NATO agreed that we would do, all the member states. And Canada has completely ignored that. In fact, the Prime Minister has said, don't expect us to do that. You cannot, don't hold your breath waiting for Canada to meet this international obligation. And then we have, for example, the Prime Minister of Japan and the Chancellor of Germany who come to Canada and practically beg us to make our energy resources available to them. And we send them away saying, oh, well, we don't think there's a business case. Like, these are the customers coming to us and saying, we want to buy what you've got. And we say, oh, we don't think there's a business case. Well, then don't anybody be surprised when people say Canada has nothing to contribute to this conversation. We have come and told them what we needed from Canada. Yeah. And Canada said, don't look to us for that. And then we get all huffy because people say we moved on from talking to Canada because Canada doesn't bring anything to the table.
I think you put it well when you were saying we have interests, not just sentimentality. It's not about friendships. It's about our interests, about their interests, as you've just said. When your allies come to you and say, look, Russia's invaded Ukraine, we can't buy their energy, you've got it, we need some, and we say no, it's hard to explain to people that we are looking at as either friends or as interests.
Yeah, well, again, back to this idea that, in the international world, you're only as good as what you bring to the table.
Yeah.
And, I think part of our problem in our relationship with the United States is that basically the way we run that relationship, and you were closer to it than I am, and you may say, no, you're completely wrong about this. But my impression is the way we manage that relationship is every time we see a problem, we show up and we kind of wring our hands and say, why are you so mean to us? We're your best friends. And the way America thinks about the world, and I think most countries think this way, they say, okay, what are the problems that we face? And I'm here to tell you that America doesn't think Canada is a problem, so it doesn't loom large on their radar screen. China's a problem, North Korea is a problem, the Middle East is a problem, Russia is a problem. These are things that America cannot afford to ignore. And so when Canada comes to the table and says, please, Mr. Big Neighbor of ours, give us all that we want, but don't expect anything in return. America says, sorry, don't have time for this. I got real problems.
And one worse is what we also do a lot of, and I had a lot of friends and colleagues in the US explain this one to me pretty pointedly. Quit wagging your finger at us with that sense of smug self-superiority. We don't need that. We know what our flaws are. Do you know what yours are? But don't lecture us.
Oh, I completely agree. And in my talk, I made reference to the fact that, some years ago, there was a volume published by the American sort of foreign relations establishment. And there was a chapter in there about Canada. And the chapter was entitled The Stern Voice of the Daughter of God, because that's how Americans think of us. They think, oh God, here comes this self-righteous, finger-wagging, moralistic neighbor of ours, always ready to tell us what we're doing wrong, but never willing to say what they're willing to do to help us make the world a better place. And after a while, I got to tell you, anybody would stop listening to that.
Yeah, you actually had tough words for both sides, though, and you pointed out, I think, quite rightly, that there is unfamiliarity, a level of ignorance, lack of awareness about who we are and what we do. I mean, we know a lot of things about America. America doesn't know a lot of things about us, other than it's cold and a place to ski. And so that it's although we make it difficult, it's also incumbent on them to get up to speed.
Well, up to a point, but I actually think that, just remember, there's something very simple. Canada exports 1/2 of everything that's made in the private sector. We export 1/2 of everything we make in the private sector. We're one of the most export-dependent countries in the world. And where do we send like 90% of that? We send it to the United States. And so America, on the other hand, they export about, well, the international trade accounts for about a quarter of American GDP. So in terms of the entire world, they're much less dependent than we are. So in terms of, should America know more about us? Sure. Should we expect them to know more about us? Probably not. Because back to this idea that they're going to be preoccupied by problems. And the fact that we are dependent on them is not their problem. So, if we are not getting out of the relationship with the United States what we think we need, I think the first place to look is in the mirror.
Yeah.
The first place to look is, why don't we connect better with Americans? What is it about what we say to them about who we are and our relationship that leaves them completely indifferent and unmoved? Because I think that's where we are today.
And sometimes it's confusion, just in thinking about what our conversation would touch on today. I went back and I reread the speech that Chrystia Freeland, our deputy prime minister, gave. She went to Washington and gave this speech, and kind of out of nowhere, nobody knew why she was there or why she was doing it, and started talking about this energy issue and that we should be there for our allies, when it's totally at odds with everything that her prime minister is saying, and certainly the environment minister is saying. So we're also sending some pretty conflicting signals.
Absolutely, we are. Americans don't know what Canada wants because, frankly, Canada doesn't know what it wants.
Yeah.
And we cannot expect America to fill that gap for us. And we pride ourselves on knowing the United States. I personally have my doubts that we know America as well as we think we do.
We think we do. That's right.
But this is a different point. I think before we manage our relationship with the United States successfully, we have to ask ourselves, who are we? Who are we that are trying to manage this relationship? What do we want from the relationship? And I'm here to tell you that we will get different things out of that relationship depending on whether we think we're there to wag our finger in America's face, or whether we're there to say, look, this is what we need. My experience of Americans is they never mind. In fact, they quite like it when people show up and say, look, I need something from you.
Yeah.
And here's what I'm willing to do for you in return. They love that conversation.
Yeah.
But they don't want somebody to show up and say, you guys, you're an embarrassment. You do everything wrong. And we don't really know what we can do for you, but we're here to tell you all the things you should do for us.
Yeah, we used to have that discussion all the time, which is Americans are very straightforward. They don't want to sit around and sip tea and get to know one another. It's, what do you need? What have you got in exchange? It's very transactional. And when you understand that, everybody can save a lot of time and get stuff done. Anyway, I want to come back to the energy issue, but just before I do, this whole question of security trumping trade, when I think about the Arctic and our inability to put up any kind of shield there as we deal with Russia, the problems we've had with NORAD because of our unwillingness to be part of the North American defense shield or spend the money that was needed for so many years. I mean, they literally took us out of the room, the inside room at NORAD. But again, these are self-inflicted wounds.
Yes. And the Arctic is a great example of how I think we're getting the relationship completely wrong with the United States. I mean, back to this idea that, America sees a world beset by problems. It's the only superpower. China isn't there yet, as far as I'm concerned. For them, they have to think about, how do I manage all these problems? One of the things that America's friends need to do as part of their relationship with the United States is they need to be able to say, America, I can take some of these problems off the table for you, right? Whether it's Haiti, creating instability in America's backyard in the Caribbean, or whether it's an ability to defend the Arctic, because as a former governor of Alaska once said, I can see Russia from here. Canada can't deliver on those promises. It says, well, don't ask us to go to Haiti because we don't have enough people in the military, and we're no longer able to do that sort of thing. And when the new head of NORAD, an American general, there's a dual command structure in NATO, so that the commander is, and the deputy commander is always a Canadian. So when the new head of NORAD goes to have his confirmation hearing before the American Senate, one of the things that happens is one of the senators from Alaska, who cares a lot about Arctic issues, says to the new nominee to head NORAD, he says, when you get this job, will you be sure to tell the Canadians how disappointed America is that they're not living up to their commitments under NORAD and under NATO, doing the things that they need to do in order to be a reliable defense partner. Back to this idea that security trumps everything in the United States. The general says, Senator, absolutely, you can count on me to raise that with the Canadians. What's really being said here? The subtext of this is, we can't count on Canada to do its part. We have to do this ourselves. And I'm here to tell you that Canadians won't like it if America decides that Canada has become irrelevant in protecting America from threats in the Arctic, because America won't just say, oh, well, I guess we won't protect ourselves then. They're not going to say that. They're going to say, we're going to push Canada aside and do the job ourselves. And that is something we don't want to see happen. But we have to then shoulder our share of the burden, which I don't think we're doing.
Yeah. And I mean, just at the recent Halifax Security and Defense Forum, I mean, this was again on the table. The head of our military, Wayne Eyre, a good Saskatchewan boy, having to say to his counterparts, we don't have operational capability. Like, we can't stand up. And we see even in the mini budget that the only department that is taking a real cut is defense. So that's, again, a loud message. They can look at the numbers. My institute published a paper by our very distinguished defense analyst, Richard Shamuka, before the Halifax Defense Forum, in which we said, Canada is losing the ability to be present as a military power. We're losing the ability even to defend the Canadian homeland from external threats. And, everyone, the most basic study of international relations will tell you the first duty of a national government is to protect the integrity of the national territory. And we're in a position now where not only can we not help America solve problems in Haiti and elsewhere, but even a small contribution to Ukraine and leadership of the NATO mission in Latvia leaves us unable to participate in all the other challenges that the world faces. And the idea that we could expand our Latvia mission is being, rubbished by knowledgeable defense analysts who say, how could we expand our mission in Latvia? We don't have the people or the resources to do it. The other, and this came up again with the Prime Minister's speaking of finger wagging, lecturing Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, and he responded literally in seconds, saying, back off until you know a little bit more what you're talking about. But the other leaders must be seeing that as well. I mean, in Washington or in London, there's got to be a response saying, okay, where's that coming from?
Well, you see, I think it goes right back to what we started our conversation with, AUKUS and the Quad and all these institutions that are emerging to deal with the world's new problems. And it's not just the United States in these organizations, Kingdom and Australia and Japan and India, they're all part of these organizations. And none of them have said, wait a minute, where's Canada? Canada is a Pacific power. Canada has military capacity. Canada is one of the largest economies in the world. People keep saying Canada's a middle power. I'm here to tell you, amongst the 200 nations in the world, we are big. We are big, but we do not shoulder our responsibilities towards the world community and our friends and allies the way that these other people do, and they've decided they're not waiting for us anymore.
Yeah, and the Five Eyes, the kind of not being on the call when it comes to these very basic questions, and people have raised some obvious concerns. Our vulnerabilities to China, as everybody has seen, about their infiltration of our universities and our political system, and we've let them into the north to map the bottom of the waters there, which is also a problem. But I guess it also is on the focus on diaspora politics in Canada, which also makes us vulnerable on the other side of the coin, which is if those are our interests, if we're motivated in pleasing this group or pleasing that group for electoral purposes, it means you're making decisions on domestic political grounds, not your role as a partner.
I think you've touched on something terribly important here, Pamela, which is that the government in Ottawa clearly thinks that they can run their foreign policy merely by consulting the interests and the opinions of diaspora communities within Canada. So that, for example, we have damaged terribly our relationship with India, one of the rising powers in the world, a country that almost everyone in the Liberal Democratic Western Alliance sees as a potential vital counterweight to China. And we've done everything we can to alienate the Indian government, not as part of a conscious foreign policy strategy, but in order to placate certain communities within Canada in order to attract their votes in the next federal election. And my view would be that this is a very bad trade-off, that we are damaging our interests as a country internationally in order to get very short-term transitory political benefits for the party that happens to be in power. And I'm not saying that other parties don't also engage in this. It's not something where I'm singling out the Liberals, but the Liberals are the happen to be the party in power, and they are the ones who are responsible for the foreign policy we pursued in the last decade. So I think they need to wear this.
Yeah. Someone described it, I don't know whether it was your word or somebody else's, is that we have kind of a performative approach to foreign policy, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of emoting, a lot of hectoring, but not, you are what you do. You have to be judged by your actions, not just your words. And if we're not stepping up to the table, if we're not paying our way, if we're not answering the calls when they come, then it is just performance art. It's not foreign policy.
Well, and, again, just having come back from Washington, where I've been, it was my third visit in the last few months, where I've been talking to Americans about their thoughts about Canada. This theme comes up over and over and over again. Canada talks a lot, but as a former foreign minister of ours said, Canada talks a lot around the dinner table in the restaurant, but when the bill comes, we head for the washroom, right? And this is very much the view of the people who are responsible for managing American policy, whether it's trade policy, foreign policy, defense policy, national security, intelligence sharing. All of them are increasingly coming to the conclusion that don't look to the Canadians to do anything helpful. They're along for a free ride. We certainly expect to hear from them when they're not happy about something. But when we need them to make a contribution to world stability, security, the safety of North America, et cetera, they just don't show up.
You cited some pretty staggering figures in your remarks in Washington a few days ago. $190 billion worth of two-way trade in energy.
Yep.
Mostly oil and natural gas, because the US doesn't have a lot of heavy oil, so it comes from Canada. 96% of our oil exports, and you were referencing this earlier, go there. So this is an area where they need us. And again, because our focus has been more on the climate change file than the trade file or the relationship with allies file, we've pulled that back. But so too have the Americans. I mean, President Biden's first move was to, thwart the Keystone XL pipeline. So we're both bad players here.
Oh, I completely agree. And when I went down to Washington to give that talk to launch our new Center for North American Prosperity and Security, this is part of what I said to the United States. I said, look, there's two things going on here. On the one hand, you're not saying clearly enough to Canada what you need, and this in this two-way relationship. America needs to be clear about what they need from Canada, and I think that this is much neglected. But on the other hand, America needs to understand just how deeply intertwined our countries are, and how it is increasingly difficult for America to defend its own interests without understanding its reliance and dependence in many areas on Canada, and the way that Canada can be a solution to some of America's problems. And energy is top of mind, but we've already talked about the Arctic. The Arctic's another area where that is equally true. But if we talk about energy, so $190 billion of two-way trade, of which 80% it's Canada selling energy to the United States, and it's not just oil and gas. It's also electricity. It's also uranium, to mention something that's of terrific interest to people from Saskatchewan, because they have the richest deposits in the world. It's terribly important that America understand that, when they buy energy from us, not only are they getting a secure supply of energy that can't be cut off by, conflicts in other parts of the world, but it also means that the billions and billions of dollars that they're spending on energy to buy it from Saudi Arabia or Colombia or Venezuela or wherever it is not going to nasty regimes around the world that don't have America's interests at heart. It's going to Canada, and is being spent on things that are in America's interest. So this energy conversation, I think, is one of the most important that we must have with the Americans. And it's one of the ways in which we can underline to the Americans how Canada can be an important solution to some of America's problems, because that's when you get their interest.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, they ended up going to Venezuela, that has some of the dirtiest oil in the world. I mean, we get some as well, instead of the Keystone pipeline. But again, it's about our signaling as well. I mean, if we are saying the climate issue trumps everything, then we're sort of saying to them, well, maybe you do need to go and find that somewhere else, because we're not going to put too much skin in that game.
Yeah, I mean, given that, we're not going to stop using oil and natural gas anytime soon. We, the world, who knows what policies will be pursued in Canada to try and get us to stop doing it. But even in Canada, the figures are eloquent that we have decades ahead of us of reliance on fossil fuels. When you look at the fact that the oil patch in Canada has a plan to spend $75 billion getting the greenhouse gas emissions out of the oil patch, so that our heavy oil is cannot be sold in the United States as dirty oil. And you compare that to, as you say, Venezuela, where America has just recently lifted the sanctions on Venezuela because America needs heavy oil, and Venezuela has made some pretty modest promises about democratic reform in order to get those sanctions lifted. It's the dirtiest heavy oil in the world. We've got the cleanest heavy oil in the world, but they cancel Keystone XL and lift the sanctions on Venezuela. I think this is an indictment of how both sides, Canada and the United States, run their relationship. That something so ignorant of the interests of both countries and of our standing relationship could have happened.
Do you think that we're sort of on the cusp of some change there? I mean, we've watched the Americans go ahead with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. It's really about a lot about subsidies to the green sector, and we haven't done that. We're doing there are subsidies to the green sector, but we have taken on the carbon tax, which is now highly controversial here. Does there have to be some reckoning domestically on both sides to open up the pathway to that conversation about having a more sensible energy exchange?
Sure, I think absolutely. And one of the things that I always say in this context is, if you look at the United States now, Biden and the Democrats are very much invested in the climate change issue. Yeah. They want to do what they can to help America's greenhouse gas performance. And indeed, America's greenhouse gas performance is amongst the best in the world. They have really done a remarkable job in reducing the American economy's reliance on greenhouse gas emissions, largely by getting out of coal for electricity generation. But they have also said, but we recognize that we need all kinds of energy. We need to have a full range or panoply of energy sources. That includes oil and gas, but it also includes green sources and electricity and hydro and all these other things, and nuclear. Canada, on the other hand, has narrowed very much its thinking about what's kind of acceptable energy sources, where we want to reduce our effort in oil and gas and make it hard to build infrastructure and all these other things. This is not what America is doing. And yet, in spite of all our efforts in this field, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions performance is worse by a considerable margin than the United States. So, again, back to the idea that we're busy virtue signaling as hard and as fast and as energetically as we possibly can, that we're the world's poster child for combating climate change, and America is still too reliant on oil and gas. But America's performance far outpaces Canada's in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So once again, we're talking a good game, but we're not delivering. And I think, far from pointing the finger at America and saying, bad America, too much dependence on oil and gas, we shouldn't build infrastructure, we shouldn't let them burn Canadian oil and gas. We need to take a page from the American book and think about how to have a balanced approach to national security, climate change, energy. These things all require us to balance a lot of factors, and Canada is failing to do that on a massive scale.
You've launched this new institute in the U.S., the Center for North American Prosperity and Security, and you pronounce it Synapse, which is kind of interesting, right? Are the ideas really jumping across those synapses or not? I'm not so sure. But you're doing this at a time when both countries are consumed, as they usually are, with electoral politics. The Americans heading into their election year, it looks like it's going to be Biden versus Trump again. I just like a few of your thoughts on that. And then we don't know what will land here. We know what the numbers are, but there's change afoot any way you look at it. So what are your thoughts?
Well, look, who knows? A year out from the election, if you look at past performance, the person leading in the polls a year out is rarely the person who wins the election. So, let's not get too excited about this. But if I were a betting man today, I would say that Trump is at least as likely to win the election a year from now as Joe Biden is. Perhaps he's got the advantage. We've already had an experience of 4 years of Trump and the influence that he had on the Canada-US relationship. And, there's a couple of things we can learn from that. One is that a President Trump can do a lot of damage to that relationship. The other is the relationship is larger than the one between the administration and Ottawa. And, the great genius of the American political experiment is to have power so diffuse in Washington. Everybody's got a little piece of it, but nobody's got too much of it. Even if there is a President Trump again, who it seems to be impervious to reasoned argument. He has his prejudices, and that's the only thing that motivates him and moves him to do anything. If you don't have friends and allies in Congress, in the State Department, in the state houses, and so on, a Trump presidency can really run roughshod over the relationship between Canada and the United States. There's already talk that he, will want to renegotiate yet again the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States. And God, if there's something that touches Canada's national interests, it's that, for reasons we've already talked about. I think now is the time to begin to raise the quality of the conversation in Washington about our relationship, so that, if there is a Trump presidency, we will have inoculated ourselves, perhaps to some degree, against the worst dangers that such a presidency might pose to Canada.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you have to infiltrate at all levels, because the president with their system is just one branch, right? Yeah. And you have to have the others. Really interesting conversation, Brian. Thank you, and good luck with having that conversation on the U.S. side of the border as well through your new operation there. I'm going to leave you with one thought, because we did talk about messages that I heard and listened to when I lived in the U.S., but I have a cartoon, which is one of my favorite ones, and it's on my wall, and it's a couple sipping martinis in a bar somewhere in New York. And he says to her, "You seem familiar, yet somehow strange. Are you by any chance Canadian?"
Yes, I know. It's a New Yorker cartoon. I always love that cartoon.
It just seems always to sum it up at the end, which is we do remain familiar but strange to them.
Exactly. And it's up to, America doesn't care enough to spend any time on this relationship. It's our responsibility to make sure that America knows what it needs to know about Canada, and that we manage that relationship intelligently. They're not going to do it for us.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Brian. We will talk again. I know we will. Brian Lee Crowley, who is the managing director of the MacDonald-Laurier Institute. That's what that little MLI behind there stands for. So we will talk soon. All the very best, and happy Thanksgiving to our American friends. We'll put it that way. Bye-bye for now. And that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll see you again soon.